Hey folks, welcome to Between Awesome and Disaster. This is your host, Will Carey. Thank you for tuning in as always. As I'm sure you know if you've listened for a while, I appreciate that you're here. This is the 100th episode of Between Awesome and Disaster, so I feel great that I'm at this place with this podcast and that you're here with me as a listener of the show. And if you've been with me for the first time today or you've been listening for a while, as I say often in the intros, thank you very much for being here. I really do appreciate the fact that you listen, because I still feel like I am just another guy in the world trying to make a career out of doing something creative. And it took a while to hit 100 episodes of this show. It took a little bit longer than should have. I've been doing this since early 2016 is when I started doing this podcast, and my life was in a very different place. When I started the show, I would record in my old apartment in off the 7 train in Queens, and I would, have to hunt for the best room in the house to keep from getting radio interference from the firehouse that was on the block up from my apartment. And I was figuring out how to use my equipment and how to edit audio as I went along. And I'd have interruptions like roommates coming in and out. And I would feel great if I got an episode that got listens into the double digits. And I was interviewing friends and just trying to find somebody who was interested in what I was doing. And at episode 100 now, I'm at a place where I have some confidence in both my production knowledge, as well as I have this growing catalog of interviews that I've done with folks that I'm really proud of. And I've got to thank all of my friends in the New York City comedy community for taking time out of their lives to come and talk with me, even if we were close friends, and even the people I don't know super well in person. It really meant a lot, because them taking the time to do that was a part of my learning process. And I got to thank people like Schaefer the Dark Lord and MC Lars and Kevin Allison from the State, comedian Tom Rhodes, people I'm massive fans of, who shouldn't have to take the time out of their busy days to talk to someone like me who isn't famous. But the fact that they did that meant a lot to me, and I really appreciate the time that everyone who's been on this show has given to me. And I thank you guys again for listening. Because we're doing the 100th episode, I want to tell you guys about something that I'm going to be starting as of this episode. I just finally signed up for Patreon because I know how the digital media landscape is in 2019 when I'm recording this. I don't want to hold my content hostage behind a paywall, and I'm not at a place where I'm advertising, and I want to continue to keep this show available to anyone, because I sincerely think, outside of doing stand-up comedy, acting, auditioning for things, this show and this podcast has brought me the greatest creative fulfillment, the greatest emotional fulfillment, and the most success that I've had as a creative person, even back to when I was just figuring out that this is what I wanted to do, and when I was doing plays in high school. So I've got a Patreon. It's patreon.com/awesomedisaster. If you can or are able to sign up to contribute on that platform, you'll have access to bonus content that I don't post anywhere else on social media or on this podcast. That stuff is specifically if you want to support me financially. And I understand you may not be be able to or be interested, you just want to listen to this show, I appreciate that you're here. So that's why I don't want to put episodes of Between Awesome and Disaster behind the paywall. So even still, as I say every time, if you're able to share the Patreon link or share episodes of the show, that means means a big deal to someone like me who's doing most of this myself. You've heard me say on a couple of episodes, especially the one with Alex Von David, the voiceover director for the English version of Sword Art Online. Another big thank you to him because I love that show so much, and he put up with me saying, "Hey, could they adapt these books too?" Completely lost my train of thought, but. More or less. If you enjoy my show, I want it to still stay free and available. So keep listening. If you're able to contribute on Patreon, I will have bonus goodies for you. You can see what the tiers are. If anything strikes your fancy, I'd appreciate you signing up. So thank you guys again for being here for 100 episodes. And today's episode is actually I think the best guess I could have for the 100th episode of this show is the host of the podcast 100 Words or Less, and the frontman for the band Taken is Ray Harkins. Ray hosts is a podcast host, DIY music, independent culture kind of guy, and interestingly enough, we work for the same company. If you look at my Twitter, you'll see what my day job is, and you can hear the difference in the recording quality of this intro compared to my intros on episode 1 with David Lawson back to when I recorded that first episode. That's actually a redo because I didn't plug the recorder in all the way and didn't pick up anything, so that's actually a redo. And now I'm talking in this very nice microphone in this very nice studio, so you can figure out information about me if you want to stalk me on social media. But Ray is a guy that is someone whose podcast I've been a big fan of before I was aware that we had a little bit more of a business connection than than I realized. So it was really cool to kind of start getting to chat with him like over social media, instant message, and kind of talk about bands and stuff. And he said he would do the show, and I thought this would be the perfect guest, episode 100 of Between Awesome and Disaster, to have the host of 100 Words or Less, the podcast, on. So that's who we're going to talk to today. If you enjoyed this and you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Comic Will Carry. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at AwesomeDpod, wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and you can also get the 100 Words or Less podcast anywhere you listen to your podcasts as well. Thank you guys very much for being here, and let's go to my chat with Ray Harkins.
Yeah, buddy.
Hey, Ray.
Will, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. How are you? Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, it's my absolute not pleasure. Why would I ever do a podcast? I hate this medium. Oh, wait, no, wrong. Sorry, that was the wrong interview.
Yeah, I imagine. So it's like I actually find that I'm more dialed into podcasting. I'm like never not thinking about like RSS feeds and like MP3s and various audio encoders now.
Yeah, totally. Well, yeah, it's such a weird industry where, and I mean, I guess every industry could be like this, where it's like once you get so like focused on your job and the things that are like, all the moving parts of it, then you're like, you poke your head up and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. There's like an outside world that doesn't care about if this is in a WAV file or an MP3 file. This is fine.
Yeah, exactly. That's my whole thing has been like I like going to WAV and then condensing down to MP3, but that's like the really like hardcore nerdy stuff that I can't imagine anyone else thinks of. But what I wanted to tell you is when I first started working at this job, when we were still in a WeWork in the New York office. Yep. I was like still learning the ropes, and they were showing me like, oh, here's this thing, and I was like going through all the shows we did, and I was like, wait, the 100 Words or Less podcast?
You're like, wait a minute.
I know that show. And then I was like, oh my, Oh my gosh, I was like, I really felt dialed into the industry when I realized that we are work for the same company, man.
Oh yeah, no, it's yeah. When when you when there's something that you pay attention to that like gets validated by something else somewhere, you're kind of like, oh, cool. Like, so this is a legitimate thing that I'm listening to, as opposed to like, oh yeah, just my own secret.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like just like little things like that. The fact that I can get like like certain emails returned is just really exciting because I became aware of your show, and I think I've told you this before Grace connected us over Slack, is that I had heard your episode of 100 Words or Less with Buddy from Census Fail, and I just thought that was like one of the I put that up in the my personal podcast Hall of Fame, up there with like when Todd Glass came out on WTF, and like when Obama did WTF. Most of my references are Mark Maron related.
W Totally fair enough, fair enough. Yeah, but yeah, I understand what you're saying. No, I felt when Buddy approached me to kind of do this, I was, I was told. I mean, I was friends with him obviously before, but it was one of those things where I just felt like, dude, there's like millions of other places that you can like express this, but he obviously felt comfortable with me, and clearly we had enough time to be able to walk through all of it. But yeah, I just felt, and it definitely felt like a culmination in certain respects for the work that I put into it, where I was just like, oh yeah, if this is a space where people feel comfortable to like reveal that stuff, I've achieved some level of success in my own head, which that's yeah. But I appreciate. I'm glad it resonated with you, because yeah, it's still to this date my most downloaded podcast of all time. So
Oh yeah, like I was just like clicking through Census Fail stuff, trying to get in the right frame of mind before I talked to you, and I found some Billboard article. They're talking about their newest record, and when they talk about, oh, Buddy opened up, and the link, they are linking to that episode.
yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know that. It's great. Yeah, the hits still keep on coming. Evergreen conversations, always important.
Yeah, I agree, and I agree with you, and I agree with your buddy Finn McKenty also, that these kinds of podcasts and conversations might be a slower burn, but I think over their over their lifetime of however long the internet's going to exist before the world dies of heat death. I think that's the stuff that's like really, really important to have out there, because there's probably somebody who listened to that interview and was maybe dealing with something similar, and they got some perspective on it, or like an idea of where to go next, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you want me to record my end of things, or are you just recording this on your own?
Oh yeah, I've got it all set up over here. I've got it I've
Okay.
got it all set up on Pro Tools. I'm recording this on Skype.
Spectacular. Sorry.
Oh, no problem at all. I appreciate you asking, right?
Hey, from a fellow audio nerd. Well, I'm not as nerdy as you because you beat me, but at the same time, I'm always like, well, I can make myself sound a little bit better.
No, you sound great on my end. One thing I wanted to ask you in relation to the episode with Buddy, going into that, how much of this did you know about him, of the kind of the stuff he was dealing with? And because I always wonder about this, because I've had a couple episodes where it's gotten like pretty emotional, and I'm sometimes I'm searching with what to say next. The same way, like, if someone came to me and they were like, I have a problem, Will. So when you were recording that episode, like, what was going through your head, and as far as like how to respond to what he was telling you?
Yeah, so the only thing that he teed me up on was the fact that he wanted to come on the show to talk about, his fluid sexuality, his problems with, addiction. And so I just had the kind of overarching themes that he wanted to discuss. And then at that point, then I kind of just crafted the questions to, deploy strategically as we were talking. But yeah, so a lot of it was just I was reacting in real time, and ultimately the thing that I just focused on the most was giving him the space to a very non-judgmental space, because I mean, first of all, I'm not that sort of person, but second of all,
Sure.
um, the idea to let that person speak, kind of not only fluidly, but be able to articulate all of these things that they probably haven't shared, not only in a public space, but like, sitting down with the person for, an hour and a half, 2 hours or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I did my best to just kind of let him get out what he needed to. And then, as I was, kind of hearing these things in real time, would kind of, put mental pins in it. Cause, I didn't want to sit there just like, scribbling down a bunch of notes face to face. Like, it'd be a different story if we were talking like you and I are, but
right.
Because that's then the person's like, are you even listening to me? Like, I know you're writing notes to like ask me further questions, but so yeah, I just kind of put mental pins in it to where it's like, okay, that sounds like there's something more that I can unpack there, or that I'm genuinely curious about, where it's just like, how did that look like? Because I had met him, gosh, it was many years before, just like totally in passing at a show. And then once he moved out to Los Angeles, we became closer and hung out a little bit more. So I already knew him well enough to know that I could be, pretty direct with my questions, as opposed to like, kind of pussyfooting around it or whatever. So with all of that, I felt like I had enough, solid ground to stand on, to where it wasn't like I felt like I was just, because even though a person can have the space to express their story, at the same time, you want to push back and dig in when people are, expressing one thing, and you're just kind of like, wait, that doesn't make sense, or like, what about that? Because then that way that can yield really, really interesting results when you hold the mirror back to the person to be like, hey, like, you just said this, but like, I don't know if you necessarily meant it that way, or, so
Yeah.
with all that, I felt like I had enough ground to stand on to be able to walk through that and not feel like I'm just, just reacting.
Exactly. And especially if you have like a little bit of a personal rapport built in, you are kind of, you sort of have that where I feel like, there's a certain trust that gets built in situations like that. The same way I think that, two stand-up comedians, and the other thing I'm going to reference Mark Merritt again. When he had Carlos Mencia on like years and years ago, and he's able to he's picking at and like trying to get him to like kind of answer specifically to things that were being said about him. I feel like there's a little bit more of an open dialogue there, because they both do the same thing. And on a certain level, I think you and Buddy are also kind of in this kind of same scene. And then again, if you are friends, and then you're able to kind of help him steer through his thoughts that he's going through it for the first time in the moment.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the shorthand knowledge that exists when people have experienced a DIY culture, like, punk, hardcore, indie rock, or whatever, or, independent comedy, independent wrestling, anybody that has like traveled and tried to get people to show up to a room. Granted, there's of course different nuances in each of those specific verticals that I was just talking about.
Sure.
But there is that shorthand where it's like, I can't tell you the amount of people that I've been able to interact with, professionally. And granted, like, my entire career has been attached to, music or audio in some capacity. But at the same time, you're dealing with a lot of what I like to call civilians, like these are people who are just like, most of the people that work at, Midroll and Stitcher, it's like they're civilians, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, that's fine. They've just never been to a, sweaty room, 200 person show, like, and been really immersed in that subculture. And that's fine. But the moment that you meet a person that knows instinctually what you were talking about when you say, Discord records or whatever, like, there's just that, like you said, you can immediately get into it with that person and create a very, very intimate bond in moments, rather than like, all right, well, I got to figure out my way into this person. Like, do they like golf? I don't know. Do they like,
right.
You just have to figure out those other common bonds where it's just like, oh, yo, you like Allister? Okay, yeah, that's cool. I get where you're coming from.
Oh my God. I'm so glad you mentioned that specifically, because I feel like, even though we've never met face to face, I feel like when I messaged you, I was like, Ray, Tim from Allister did my show. I feel like you, out of maybe a few other people that I know, would understand how fucking awesome I was. I felt about that.
No, and it's those things where it's like you yourself, like you get excited about it, and it's like, like, do I actually like Allister? No, I personally don't, but I recognize the importance of that band to a specific, not only type of person but subset of person, and their importance within the context of pop punk and drive through records. Like, I get all of it, and so it's like I get why it is important, why it was important to you. And like I specifically mentioned that there because I know you were excited about it. So yeah, I just love that that commonality that you can put two people who had been not linked by anything besides these common experiences of, seeing bands play in a room, and then immediately become best friends with them like 10 minutes later, and just have that shorthand knowledge. And so, like you said, having the ability to exist in these systems and these universes makes it easier for people to relate and kind of have that common bond, where it's just like, oh yeah, what it's like to play in front of 4 people, like, and it's like, hey, what it's like to like bomb on stage. And it's like, yeah, I remember, like, I've never done stand-up comedy, but I definitely remember when the guitarist in my band broke a string and we didn't have a backup guitar, and I had to like chop it up for 5 minutes and was failing miserably. Like, it probably feels the same way.
Oh my, oh my God. You've said a couple of things that have just given me like such, just like PTSD sweat, just that anxiety. Yeah. Well, just the first thing is the anxiety of trying to get people to show up in a room. Like that's sort of stress of like, and I feel like comedy is similar to DIY punk culture in a lot of respects, because that sort of stress of like, oh, we have a $200 guarantee on this bar show in rural Minnesota. Am I going to look like an asshole to the owner of this place?
Yeah. Oh, totally. It's it really is that live communal experience, like I said, and that's why those are really, wrestling, comedy, and music have similarities. Like, once I started to become more immersed in each of those, as far as just like my knowledge and my fandom, and then seeing the parallels between all of that, where it's just like, oh yeah, like the commonality between all of those is getting people to show up at a place and asking them to pay money for it and have some intrinsic value attached to it. And the underpinning of it all is that there will be some level of entertainment, hopefully in some capacity, as long as people are doing it generally right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really related to something like you when you bring up wrestling, that because wrestling has done something that I think like punk and like metal and like hardcore culture should start doing. And I saw it on your Twitter account before I started calling you, is doing more podcast stuff, because I feel like pro wrestling figured out, hey, a good portion of pro wrestling outside of the actual wrestling match is talking shit on a microphone, and podcasting is a great way to do that without having to get hit in the head with a chair.
Absolutely. Well, and plus podcasting is the most appropriate medium to stoke fandom in general, and stoke nuance, and completely immerse yourself in the thing. Like that is why, I mean, once I discovered the medium in the mid 2000s and got completely obsessed with it, I was just like, the powers for this are like limitless, because like, I don't care whatever it is that you're into. And obviously now that podcasting has reached levels in which 3 years ago people could not even like wrap their heads around, and now there are these clear divisions between like a professionally produced mainstream podcast and then the sort of like bootstrap ones that, some rise to the level of being mainstream, like you're obviously Mark Maron, like we were both huge fans of.
Mm-hmm.
But there are, whatever it is you're interested in, you will find a podcast that completely scratches your itch and is like, oh my gosh, this is like, I can't even stamp collecting. Like, I love it. There's like 4 podcasts I can listen to about it, and you sample them all, and then you find your favorite one, and you're off and running.
Basically, like, I've just typed dentist into Stitcher, and there's just all of these podcasts hosted by dentists talking about being a dentist to dentists. It makes me laugh so much.
So, totally. I mean, like my stepdad, he's a veterinarian, and there's been some veterinarian podcasts I've seen out in the world, but I'm just like, man, we just need, like, it's not like he's some incredibly compelling person from a entertainer perspective, because he's a very quiet dude. So I can
Mm-hmm.
easily understand why he has rebuffed my idea of like, dude, let's get you on a mic and let's do a podcast about vet work or whatever. But
Right.
yeah, I just love that idea that whatever you're obsessed about, you can get into it. And it's like, like Legos. Like my son is 8 years old, loves
Mm-hmm.
Legos. I love Legos. We find podcasts about Legos and we listen to them. We're just like, this is great. It's so cool.
Oh yeah, the absolute freedom to be and talk about whatever you want is what I love about this medium so much. So you discovered podcasting in early 2000s with what was the show that really blew your mind when you first started listening to podcasts?
Yeah, it was Leo Laporte. So he's, a luminary within the tech world, but I got introduced to podcasts via him because I listened to a radio show of his. He would just do this like weekend call-in show of people talking about like, hey, my camera doesn't work, and like what, or can I do this thing with my computer, whatever. It was like real basic answer, question and answer stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But then he started talking about he's like, oh, if you like this content, like I do a podcast called This Week in Tech. And then he started doing like This Week in Apple News, and This Week in I want to say like This Week in Microsoft at some point. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was interested in technology at that point. And so once I heard him plugging this once or twice, I was like, I gotta look into this. And I think at that time, yeah, I want to say iTunes had podcasts as a part of it, but it was like totally just the dust-ridden corner. Like you had to, there's like 14 steps to get you to the thing you actually wanted to get to. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, just started downloading them to my computer, and then, manually put them on my iPod, and I was off and running. And then once, because that was probably like 2000, I want to say 2005-ish or so.
Mm-hmm.
And then at that point, I mean, obviously the medium was in its absolute infancy,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
then I started to see comedians utilizing it for, their own selfish purposes of promoting shows, and obviously
Mm-hmm.
having the sort of chat-based stuff. So that's when, and to your point, or to your fandom, like that's when Marin came into my life, and I was like, oh wow, this is great. So but yeah, Leo Laporte, I give him all the credit for introducing me to podcasts in general.
Excellent. And so I kind of want to trace this because when I don't know what your early life was like growing up, but I can't imagine that you thought that radio or this medium was where you might end up. Um, I'm curious about your early life. Did you grow up in California?
No, I grew up. I mean, a simple answer is yes, because I was born in Las Vegas, moved out to Southern California when I was about 7,
Uh huh.
and but most of my formative years were all in Southern California, and specifically Orange County. I didn't move out until basically I went to college 1 year in San Diego, so that was my first time living on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've basically bounced around the Orange County area from like Huntington Beach to Long Beach, but it's all been based around Orange County.
Gotcha. Now, I was hoping you could confirm something for me. My idea of Orange County from popular culture is that it is like the almost like kind of and is Bakersfield in Orange County? My idea is that Orange County is like the conservative like stronghold in Southern California.
It's Well, at one point, yes, you would be correct in that statement. So Bakersfield is about 2.5 hours north of me. It's about an hour, hour and some change outside, like north of Los Angeles as well. Bakersfield is kind of the start of what you would call the Central Valley of California,
Mm-hmm.
um, which Bakersfield, like it's just not a very cool town. It's just, I mean, it's
Yeah.
farm community, desert. Like they actually, I mean, you could play shows in Bakersfield at this venue called Jerry's Pizza, which was literally the basement of a pizza shop. But there wasn't. It wasn't a bastion of culture where it's just like, oh, dude, like, because Korn came from Bakersfield, and
Right.
they immediately got out once they realized that there was more to the world than Bakersfield. But Orange County in particular, there's a lot of, because basically it's just one giant suburb, and
Yeah.
it's very wealthy. It is very, it has been conservative for a very long time, but only recently, this past midterm election, stuff has definitely started to shift, and a lot of people who had been, you know, members of Congress and for the House of Representatives, like they had been Republican for 20 or 30 years, and they just recently made a shift. So there is a lot of old people and mixed with sort of younger people and younger families that are existing here. So the makeup is kind of changing, but a lot of the reality shows that you saw maybe in the early 2000s from like the OC and the Hills and all that other stuff, like there's some truth to that, and the Real Housewives, cliques and stuff like that all exists, and there's just a ton of money. But at the same time, there's also a lot of opportunities for younger people to kind of get their foothold and be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna live in an apartment and kind of figure out working for this large financial institution or whatever. So it's an interesting mixture.
Gotcha. Yeah, my idea of what was, other than because California, like the suburban parts of California, like trigger like the inner pop punk kid that loved all those "Get Out of This Town" kind of songs. Sort of gives me that sort of suburban anxiety, and that's why whenever I visit my parents, I tend to only be able to handle it for like a couple of days at a time. But places like that, and this is a theory that I test against everyone I know who's involved in punk culture in some way, is that places like that, I think, are kind of like fertile grounds for activity. Even though if there's that only the one venue, I feel like places like that where you kind of are developing your own culture and entertainment, I think allow cool scenes like that to kind of thrive.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel so lucky and grateful to be raised in Southern California, just because Orange County in general has had a very, very vibrant and fluid music scene for many, many years. And there has been never a shortage of options as far as like, yes, there's been shifting options over time, but in regards to like all ages venues and like the existence of, subcultures as far as like, because I mean, you can completely link, skateboarding, surf culture, all to Southern California. Like, I mean, it's the birthplace of both of those subcultures. Well, not even subcultures because they're clearly mainstream now, but both of those cultures. And to have them directly attached to music as well, it's like all of this stuff was ping-ponging back and forth with one another, since the early 80s, and to allow it to incubate to the point of where it's like, in the early 90s is when I was in, 11, 12, 13 years old, and being able to kind of tap into the fact that it's like, the years that mainstream punk broke from, Offspring and Rancid and Green Day and all that sort of stuff, and being able to have those bands come down so frequently and see all of those bands, and then kind of the, sub-level of those bands like, Guttermouth and No Use for a Name and all the, Epitaph and Fat Records bands, all that stuff was so steeped in our culture and our music culture down here that it felt unescapable, even though many of my friends weren't directly into it. But and then couple that with the fact that there was the huge power player of a radio station, K-Rock, and they had those amazing K-Rock weenie roasts, where those radio shows, and they would pull together such weird bands all playing together, and 14-year-old me was stoked to see Sublime and Bush and like. So anyways, all of that to say that Southern California was just such a an incubator for all of that stuff, and I'm really glad that I was able to kind of see all of that and be able to exist where it wasn't just like one or two venues. It was like, I mean, granted, a lot of it you had to travel, where it was like, okay, I at one point when I was 17, 18, 19, going to a ton of shows and playing a ton of shows, there were so many options. You could go to San Diego, you can go to Santa Barbara, you could go out to Corona. Like, all of this was within an hour to an hour and a half's drive. And you would sometimes follow tours as they went through Southern California, and you would just be like, oh yeah, like Poison the Well's coming through, so of course I'm gonna go to San Diego, Orange County, and Ventura to see them all three times. Like, that's just what you did. And so it was really, really fun to be able to experience that, and then watch it evolve to where it's like, okay, this all ages venues went away, and it was a real bummer that this went away, but there are certain things that you never would have imagined being successful, like Chain Reaction. And now it's like, the people have jokingly called it the CBGBs of the West Coast. And it's like, well, I wouldn't go so far as to call it that, but it's definitely legendary for many people.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds so freaking cool, dude.
Yeah.
So
it's fun.
So So you got to see like so you saw like Rancid and Green Day like early on when you were a kid?
Well, so yeah, I mean, Rancid definitely around the and Out Come the Wolves time. I mean, Green Day I did not see like in the Kerplunk and 1039 Smooth Out
Smooth
Slappy
Out,
Hours or whatever. Yeah,
Slabby Hours,
I didn't
yeah.
see them in those iterations because they were playing those songs like 90, 91. And so, I mean, Dookie was like my record, like many other people's records of
Mm-hmm.
the introduction to them. So when I started to see them play, they had already, started to really blow up. And so I was seeing them in front of thousands of people. But, but Offspring, I was able to see a little bit before they kind of broke. Because K-Rock, like a couple of months before Smash came out, started to play all of the singles and really got behind them. So I was able to see them, in front of like 1,500 people as opposed to like 10,000 or whatever. But Rancid for sure. No Effects, Blink 100%. I saw Blink when they were just called Blink as opposed to Blink 182.
Oh,
Because
awesome. They're my
I
favorite band.
dude, I still have Cheshire Cat on tape when it's just called Blink, and I hold on to it dearly. People have joked around, were like, "Dude, just sell it on eBay," and I was like, I'm never gonna sell that. It's like Eminem's holds a very special place in my heart, and I'll never listen to that tape, but it will always be meaningful to me.
Yeah, you've got to hold on to that. That's amazing. That that's so freaking cool, dude. Because they're sort of like they were like my come to Jesus moment. I was like, oh, power chords. Did you have a moment like that when you were a kid? Did you have like a moment when you first saw a punk rock band and it just blew your little mind?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, around that same time too was obviously when grunge was happening. So
Mm-hmm.
being both of and plus, like I love that time in your life where you are consuming music devoid of context. You were just really reacting to stuff, whether you like it or you don't, as opposed to, oh, I'm listening to this because this band thanked this band in a thank you list or whatever, and like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
this is where this band sits in the scene and stuff like that. So I love the visceral reaction. So to say that there was like one definitive band that kind of cracked my head open, it probably, I mean, Rage Against the Machine really, really made me focus. By that time, I had, already been pretty pot committed on music and was trying to shove as much of it in my head as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But MTV had a music program called 120 Minutes.
Yep, I remember
And
it.
of course. And so I saw the Killing in the Name of video. And not only was it unlocking kind of a more aggressive style of music that I was like, dude, this is not played on your average, normal prime time, MTV program. But it also opened my eyes up to my singular experience of a privileged white suburban boy was not what everybody else was experiencing. And to have that kind of reflected on me, I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh my God, oh, not everybody has the same experience as me. And, when you have that shared to you at 11, 12, or 13 years old, like it is profoundly impactful. And so
Yeah.
I think I use that as a real kind of turning point for me to understand contextually what this band was trying to say and trying to get across, and like how it directly applied to my life beyond just being like, oh, like that band's good, and like, I like this record or I like this song or whatever. This like impacted me on a real, a more deeper level than just kind of the surface.
Yeah, yeah, that's an important moment to have the not everybody lives like I do moment, and that is the band to give you that in the '90s especially. Okay, okay, so you're just shoving music, so you're shoving music into your head in this fertile, like, amazing time in Southern California, punk rock. When is the time when you decide you're going to be in a band? When does that happen?
So that happens in high school where, because by that time I was completely immersed in the sort of, pop punk Epitaph Fat record scene. Like I had, kind of filtered through all of those bands and really liked all those bands. And then I started to kind of put more building blocks on there in regards to getting into like Revelation Records and Victory Records and starting to understand like the more aggressive side of things. Like I had already been kind of keyed into, like Subhumans and Dead Kennedys and like a lot of that, classic punk stuff that was, clearly not as saccharine as, Descendants and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it was definitely, the addition of Victory and Revelation. It started to, flip my switch on being interested in more aggressive stuff, specifically Victory. Victory was just a huge label for me from, Earth Crisis, Strife, Snapcase, Guilt, Dead Guy. I could go on and on. But those, early compilations they put together called Victory Style started to kind of key into the fact that I was like, okay, like more aggressive music is kind of where I'm feeling myself. And the only reason that I had any sort of, I wouldn't even say a desire to start a band, because like I had messed around with a friend in like 8th grade where I bought a drum set and he had guitars and we were just doing horrible covers like you do when you're in 8th grade.
Right.
And then it wasn't until high school, my freshman year, where I put together a band called Doom Society, which you can automatically imagine what we sound like.
Mm-hmm. I'm picturing the whole thing.
It's perfect. And you can also imagine what our demo cover art looks like, just nuclear waste and like, yeah, just like the most horrible combination of like, punk and hardcore you can imagine. That's what we sounded like.
Yeah. Did you do the cutout newsprint letters?
We did not, but because it was a hand-drawn cover. But like if I had the knowledge of that in my head, I probably would have done it like that too.
Right. Yeah, no, Victory, that makes total sense. Because this shows how much of a poser I am. To me, when you tell me Victory Records, I think Hawthorne Heights.
Oh, of course. Well, because that I mean, I'm 38, you are younger than me, and ostensibly that is your touch point to Victory. You're just like, oh yeah, like Taking Back Sunday and all that stuff, because like Victory obviously reinvented themselves many, many times over as they, the label kind of progressed. But yeah, Victory was huge for me. And so the only reason that I kind of like wanted to play in a band was because I had some time to kill between basketball practice and the end of school. So a kid that I met in my freshman year, he had a house that was, because I went to school not close to where I lived, like maybe about 25 minutes away to like a private Lutheran high school. And so I couldn't just pop home and pop back because I would be late for everything. So I would end up going over to his house. He was a killer drummer. Like he, got super into Metallica and Slayer and Sepultura at an early age. And so he was just like, his chops were unbelievable. So I was like, okay, clearly I'm not going to play drums in this thing. And when my friend plays guitar, we could probably find a bassist. I was like, the only thing left for me to do would be like scream into a microphone. And that's exactly what I did, where I was just like, oh yeah. So it just started up with us dicking around, and then we kind of put together a band, and then, played like, a handful of shows, like played Chain Reaction before it was called Chain Reaction. It was actually called Public Storage, which is so funny because clearly there's a chain of storage units called Public Storage.
Right,
like,
right.
Did you guys not understand that you can't name yourself after an existing business? But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a dance band called Microsoft somewhere that just doesn't get it either.
Yeah, it's very, very true. So yeah, but that was kind of that was the first inclination, but it wasn't like this burning desire where it's just like, man, I gotta play in a band. I gotta be like the front person of a band. I gotta do that. I knew I was interested in it, but I did not know how to actually accomplish it until we were at, my drummer's house and started to kind of like put together these ideas. And it's like, oh, this is cool.
Oh, awesome. And how old were you when you were doing that?
That was so like 14 or 15 was when Doom Society started to kind of like play around. So like my freshman and sophomore year of high school, but late sophomore years when the band I currently play in now, Taken, that's when because Doom Society fractured apart because we, whatever, but we just wanted to play different music. And so me and the drummer enlisted other people, and then that's kind of, we wanted to play more sort of hardcore specific stuff. And so that's kind of when Taken formed, and that's, basically set forth the rest of the trajectory of my life as far as all the relationships and where it all led me to.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah. The musical differences is, I think it's cliche to people that don't get it, but to people who do, it makes perfect sense, because I'd say the majority of the drummers I've played with love double bass drum death metal. And my favorite band is Blink-182. And I grew up in Maryland, and I went to college I was in high school during like the peak time for nu metal. So my former bass player, who's now playing in like a serious heavy metal band, it was like Creed and Mudvayne because he liked their bass player. But so one thing I was curious about, because I listened to Taken's most recent EP, and then I kind of want to go through this trajectory that leads you to where we're at currently. So you kind of we're kind of defaulted into the singer role, and in your interest in hardcore and heavy music, so that's what you're singing. I've always wondered how people who scream in bands are able to do it and not be completely hoarse the next day after the show. Yep. So did you like teach yourself to sing and scream correctly, or what was your process of like growing as a singer?
Yeah, it definitely was. I just taught myself. I did not have, I took vocal lessons maybe much later in my life. Like, after I was probably in my mid 20s, I took a few vocal lessons, but definitely never while I was like by that time I was still actively touring, but I had never taken them with the idea that I would like know what I'm doing. So
right.
It was a lot of just trial and error. I knew the sort of basic principles of singing because I like sing in choir and like, junior high or whatever, as far as like, singing from the diaphragm and like, being able to project. But it was definitely trial and error where it's like, once Taken started to get out there and tour, we'd be playing 7, 8, 9, sometimes 10 shows in a row. So I would have to learn how to calibrate myself. And a lot of these times too, it's not like we were playing with professional monitors. We were playing on floors, and like I was singing through like a guitar or bass amp or something.
Right.
So I couldn't hear myself. So, there would be times where I would have to like, blow my voice out just to project and make sure that I was heard over the drums and the guitars and stuff like that. So it for sure trial by, fire, error, whatever you want to call it. Into the point where it was like, I want to say it was probably 2001 or so, after we had done, our fair share of touring, is when I started to be able to feel like I could actually have control over it, as opposed to I just felt like I was kind of, flying by the seat of my pants. And when I say control over it, I mean like the durability of it more than anything else, because, I have registers that I can scream in. Obviously you don't hit notes when you scream.
Right.
But I was able to at least understand like the limitations of what I could do and what I couldn't do. And so it in simplest of terms, it's the same principles as singing, but you are just projecting yourself in a much louder way. And, sometimes that's easier said than done. And there's no way that I could like sit there with another person and try to like walk them through that, because many times it just won't work for that particular person. So it really is, just not even faking it till you're making it, but just like getting out there and doing it and realizing like your limits, and then understanding what you can do to kind of like tweak that, make it sound a little bit better, what you need to do recording wise and all that stuff. So yeah, it took a long time, that's for sure.
I've talked about this with my my voiceover, a guy I took a voiceover class with, as far as because he does lots of animation stuff, and and because I was also, in addition to like screaming and hardcore, I always feel for voice actors for English anime dubs, like
oh yeah, for sure.
Like the guy who's got to dub Dragon Ball Z, who's got to do the like 9-minute long scream.
Totally. That's brutal. So yeah, you definitely need a vocal coach for that.
Yeah. So it's just kind of like, my hat's off to you, sir. I don't think I would have the durability to continue to do that, but I love listening to that kind of stuff, because I turned 33 and then metalcore became my like, all right, I'm going to get on the bus kind of music.
Yeah, no, it's yeah, obviously I understand it's an acquired taste. It's not for everybody. And like, mostly, I mean, most people that I interact with today and understand that like I play in a band, and the moment that I show them a clip of it, or a snippet of a song, it's just like, what the hell is that? That's you? And I'm like, I know, it doesn't make any sense, because like you just know me as this one person. So there's no way that you would be able to contextualize this appropriately. But yeah, it's definitely not easy, but I was just able to kind of figure it out through, just failing at it for a very, very long time.
And again is, I feel like, the most punk way of approaching something is to just do it and figure it out while you're doing it. So tell me, I'm curious about your early times touring with Taken, because my idea of punk and DIY touring specifically, I have no idea how the business side of how any of these bands are able to of how bands make gas money when you're just connecting shows. But was touring with Taken a situation where you're like calling venues and trying to get on shows, or did you have people that you were working with?
It's so to answer the first part of that, like it's very similar to like when if you're putting together a comedy tour where it's just like, you have booking agents, they are working on your behalf, and then you basically give them a cut of your guarantee. They're taking 10 or 15% and stuff like that. But yeah, for us, it was definitely all about just networking, because when I started because I was sort of by default the business guy of the band, just because I sang for the band. It was kind of this weird thing that always happens where it's like, oh yeah, the front person of the band, like they're the most visible and they're the ones that are going to like interact with the most people at the show. And so by default, they're going to be the business person.
Right.
And frankly, I was fine taking that on because I didn't actually write any music. I wrote all my lyrics, and I worked with the band to match them up with the music, and I was kind of like a last third party editor on our songs, where it was like, once stuff was like together, I would be like, hey, maybe that could be a little shorter, maybe that could be a little bit longer, but I did not write any of the music, so I was fine taking on the sort of like pseudo managerial role of the band. So a lot of that was or the initial touring and shows were all just kind of networking, getting to know people. When bands would come through on tour and we'd play with them on tour, they would be from a certain city, and it would just be like, hey, what what are some venues that you play in your area? Maybe if we trade emails that we can stay in touch, because it was right as the internet was in its sort of infancy. You could basically just email and visit websites, and so message board culture was kind of a thing then too. And I know it still is a thing, but it was obviously much different then than it was now. So a lot of it was just like record labels had message boards, so people would kind of exchange information that way. So it was a lot of hand to mouth, just like kind of figuring out like, oh yeah, like maybe we can go up to Northern California this weekend and look for a show in San Luis Obispo, and maybe find a show in Sacramento or whatever. But then as we started to, as I started to get more ambitious on like, okay, now that like we had a record deal, and I use that in very loose air quote terms, like it was a real record label and we got paid money, but it was definitely on a very, small DIY label from Canada that did amazing things for us. But it wasn't like, hey, here's a $40,000 advance, like you guys can buy a van. And it was like, okay, cool. How much is your recording? All right, cool. We'll pay for that. And I'll also manufacture the CDs, and I'll do some promotion for you, which was like, we were over the moon about, but
right. But it's different from being on Capitol or something like that.
Completely. Yeah. And there wasn't like this infrastructure that we could immediately plug into where it's like, okay, cool, we got you a booking agent. And like, people were helping us more, and you're adding more people to the quote unquote team, but it was still a lot of hand to mouth. And so, yeah, it was networking. We eventually got to the point where there was a booking agent that he didn't officially book us, but he got us on a ton of tours and was putting a bunch of stuff together for us. And then other people who were just kind enough to like reach out to us and be like, hey, I'm putting in this tour. I think you guys would be a perfect fit for it. Do you want to do this? Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it was a lot of pulling from a lot of different sources, but through that we were able to foster a lot of these amazing relationships, because we were the touch points for everything. We were the ones who were dealing with these people. So when we'd show up to a place, it was like, oh, Aaron from Indiana, like, dude, thank you so much for doing the show. Like, we've been talking for like months, and now we're friends in real life, and like, thank you for doing the show, and thank you for paying us $250. This is incredible. So I wouldn't trade any of that difficult experience for something that may have been a little bit easier when you had a booking agent. You had, you were a few people removed from it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I relate to that very much, because the place I'm at in my comedy career right now is that it's where in New York or nearby can I get to, where can I set up a place for that I don't have to spend several $100s renting out, and then going back to the thing, how do I get people in the room?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And then when did you start touring Japan? You told me that your most recent tour in Japan was like your 7th or 11th time over there.
Yeah, dude, it's wild. So Taken, technically, we broke up in about 2004.
Mm-hmm.
We had released 2 EPs and a full length, and things were going well. But then real life started to pull people in different directions. We essentially disbanded, and then at that point, I really didn't want to stop playing in a band, and so I shifted to another band where I played in called Mikoto. I
Mm-hmm.
sang for that band. From the moment that we put our songs online, we put like 3 songs online. I had like 4 or 5 record labels from Japan hitting me up wanting to release our demo. And I had always heard anecdotally in the past about Taken that we had quote unquote done well in Japan, which I was always like, I don't even know what that means. Like if we sold 2 records in Japan, amazing success. Like there was no no concept of what that means. And so then I was able to kind of like, all right, well, I'm going to take these opportunities as they come. So like, let's figure this out. Worked with a label that released the Mikoto demo over there. He was like, I would love to have you guys over here for tour. And I'm just like, what the hell world am I living in? This is crazy, but okay. It's a demo. Like, do you understand that we don't even have a full set and you're bringing us over there? So we had 5 songs and that was it. But anyways, went over there for the first time. The shows were unbelievable. People were really, really rabid about Mikoto, but I would have a ton of conversations about Taken. And I obviously understood by starting another band, I could clearly capitalize on, any attention that was paid towards Taken.
Sure.
So that was like 2006. And then in 2007, we had formally released more music as Mikoto. And so we were able to go back to Japan again. And then at that time, my wheel started to turn, and I was talking to the guy who had put out our records over there and brought us over there. I was like, hey, if I got the guys in Taken, because like we don't hate each other, like there's no existing animosity, but like we just haven't played in many years. Like, what if we did this? And so he was like, it would be unbelievable, and I would love if you could do that. So once I got home from that tour, I had everybody in Taken up, and I was like, guys, like if we play these shows over here, they will be amazing. All the shows I've played in Japan so far have been incredible. And plus, you're in Japan. It's amazing. So
yeah.
Everybody was completely on board. And then in 2008, Taken, quote unquote, officially reformed as far as like, hey, we can't. And I knew in my head, I'm like, dude, we can't just play Japan and just like not play any shows in America. That's a weird vibe. And so
yeah,
played some shows in Southern California, played some shows in the East Coast of Canada, and then went over to Japan. And basically, we just played where we knew people would enjoy seeing us. And so by that time, the shows in Japan were unbelievable, playing in front of like 700, 800, 900 people a night. And I was like, this still does not make sense to me, because it was even bigger than what I had experienced with Mikoto. So yeah, but fast forward to 2018 or wait, what year are we in? 2019.
We're in 2019.
Yeah, I just lost a year there real quick. But then, yeah, Taken just went over to Japan, like you said, like you mentioned, in March, and that was my 7th tour of Japan between the 2 bands that I've played in, and it's still, and we're talking about going to Japan next year with another band from America, and it's just like that culture and that independent music scene just completely embraces melodic hardcore in ways that I'm like. This past time that I went over there, I was able to we worked with a different promoter for some shows, and I was able to kind of dig in with him a little bit more about the nuances of like, okay, I don't understand, like, are we considered a quote unquote big band over there, or like where do we sit? And he was like, he was throwing me some numbers just on attendance wise. He was like, every time I die played over here, which every time I die is like, as successful as you possibly can be as far as like, a metallic hardcore band is concerned in this day and age. And he was like, yeah, so the venue you guys are playing tonight, like, I've sold, like 180 tickets. When every time I die, I played the same venue, we sold 60 tickets. And I'm just like, wait, so like we've literally sold 3 times the amount of tickets than every time I die. And I'm like, that does not make any sense in my head. I was like, you realize they're huge in America? And he's like, no, I know. He's like, I don't know. And I'm like, I don't know either. None of this makes sense to me. So anyways, but that's the saga of Japan, where it's just like, they welcome us with open arms, and I will never, ever turn down that welcome, because it's just, it's such an amazing and it's not even so much about the size of the shows, like, because I really want to make sure that it's not just like this super ego gratification of like, oh, dude, look how cool I am going to Japan. It's like the experience in playing shows over there is so not only immediate and visceral as far as the way that the crowds react to
Mm-hmm.
shows over there, but it's like, when was the last time that you personally have ever seen somebody like thank a band for playing a show, and not just like thanking a band for being like, oh, it's like, oh, whatever, like, nice to meet you, like, thanks for playing or whatever, but like people like are coming up to you and just like, thank you for coming over here. And yes, of course, like there is flights and there's a lot of travel that is going into it, so people recognize that, but it's just like, dude, do you think a person from Southern California would ever thank a band from New York for like, oh, thank you so much for coming out here? It's just
Right.
expected. And so that at the core of that, just the passion of the audience and the genuine thankfulness that people have for shows that exist over there. I'm just like, oh God, just tap it right into my veins and let that run through for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Oh my God. 100%. Like I just started playing bass in a band again, and my entire dream would be to get to that level in Japan. So and if you're going back next year, if you need like a roadie or something,
Yeah,
message
just
me.
something, just right, just yeah, just tag along. Yeah, I can't tell that that may have been my 175th offer to do roadie or merch over there. So you unfortunately
I
have to
meant.
get in line. Will, I apologize, but
Oh,
yes, but thank you for your services.
oh, no worries at all. I love Japan. The both times I've been over there have just been some of my like favorite times I've ever spent living. And I don't know what it is either, but they seem to have, at least from an outside perspective, like a really fertile like rock and pop punk scene. Like there's this my latest obsession with Japanese bands. And thank you for turning me on to the band Fact. They are so good.
Dude, right?
I
Yeah,
that
there's and that's the thing. To Sorry to interrupt your train of thought too,
Oh,
but
it's all
like
good.
the when anybody that's like ever attended shows or toured in some small capacity knows that, like, when you are going to play, and honestly you can easily compare it to comedians as well, where it's just like, typically speaking, like, the local opener might not be that hot, and like that's kind of what happens in America, where it's like, oh, you're on tour and like, oh cool, the first band out of five is playing, and oh
Right.
wow, like they barely practiced or whatever. But dude, Japan, like, get out, like, I don't care, like, you can not like the band stylistically, but you watch them and you're just like, holy crap, this band is unbelievable. And every single band I've ever played with over there is like the best at their craft, and it's so amazing. And like Fact, and like you could go down the list of all of the bands that have like come over here to, as far as like, US knowledge is concerned, and you're
Mm-hmm.
just like, oh, you're infinitely better than so many bands, just because it's like, a lot of people in Japan, they just take pride in their work.
That's God. I kind of would feel like the same way as well. Like Tim was telling me that they're good friends with the band Eligard, and he says that like they sound exactly as they do on the record. They don't make mistakes ever. They are just tight, well cohesive band. And the band I was also going to mention. I'm obsessed with this. I guess you would call them like either post-hardcore or pop punk, but me and my friend Corey called them power emo.
Okay.
It's a band called the Winking Owl, and I describe them as Paramore with more interesting lead guitar. But
Okay.
just the stuff that they put together, like, and I have not listened to a single song of theirs I don't like, and it is not like derivative of anything I've ever heard before. It is just the coolest, most unique, freshest thing. Like talking about those moments when you're like having those like holy shit kind of moments when you're first like just throwing music into your head. That's what, and at this point in my life, that's what I'm getting from Japan's music scene. And the other thing I wanted to say is talking about that connection that you have with the audiences in Japan. That's the fucking dream, dude. That's like the dream of anyone who's ever wanted to be in the entertainment or business or show business in any capacity, is chasing moments like that. So that's amazing that you're able to do that.
Yeah, no, it feels, and I agree with you, and I definitely, I think more so now this past time that I went over, just because it's like the last time that I had gone to Japan was I think 2012. So it had been some time, and to still like, and maybe I know that most people instinctually manage their expectations, where they are like you don't want to go into every situation being like, oh dude, this is gonna be the best thing ever, because you're gonna be horribly disappointed. But like
Mm-hmm.
I this time I really was just like, I don't know what to expect. If there is 50 people at the show, I am going to be just as happy as if there are 200 people at the show. And it was like, there, out of the 5 shows we played, like 3 of them were just those over the moon shows, and even the 2 that weren't were still just as incredibly passionate as far as the interaction. And I'm just like, man, you could have moved on by now. You could not care about us in any capacity. There's been a million bands that are doing similar stuff to what we do, and you could have easily moved on, but you haven't. And that is like, so that's like way more meaningful than if we were like an actual quote unquote real band that was like actively touring and like trying to make
Mm-hmm.
it. So it's like this, I'm like, yo, you like sweated this, you were like looking forward to this, and like, get out of here. I can't even believe it. Just, yeah, like you said, it's kind of the dream that you chase. And yeah, I'm just thankful that I've been able to tap into a little bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like, did you ever see the Anvil documentary about the heavy metal band Anvil?
Oh, dude, so good. Love it.
So good. And that moment when they're playing a 9 a.m. show on a festival in Japan, and the crowd hasn't forgotten, and they're all so excited to be there. And because you think 9 a.m.'s a crappy slot to have on a music festival, but that's the best slot over there. It's just,
Totally.
yeah, it's just so cool, and I love that you're getting to have those experiences now. And it's great that the band you're taken never like fell apart because of like typical rock star bullshit. It sounds like you had to make some like grown up choices at a certain point in your life, and then you're able to reconfigure, and now you're kind of able to have like the best of both worlds. It sounds like if you're touring, we work in this cool job, and you have a family.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a majority of bands, well, not a majority, but a lot of bands exist in this world now, where I like to call it the full-time part-time band, where it's
Mm-hmm.
like they are, they're available for shows, and as long as like, people are able to like cover costs, then it's like, okay, that's fine. Like, sure, we'll play that show. We're not looking to make, $3,000 off of you or whatever, but it's just like, dude, cover a couple plane flights, like we'll be there. That's no problem. And so anytime, if you have the ability to tap into that, even if it's like on a super super small microcosmic level, that's just, yeah, it's great. And so yeah, to be able to kind of like have all of those things kind of working in tandem of one another, and never have it be super overwhelming, then it's like, dude, it's great. It feels good.
Oh yeah, absolutely. When I first started working here, and then I saw that you worked here, and that and that your show is part of this, you became like my new, like, I'm gonna be the East Coast Ray Harkins
That's so
of
awesome.
Stitcher. Is kind of how how I
That's
decided it. Um,
that's good.
that's great. That's great, man. One other thing I wanted to ask you a little bit about the genesis of the podcast before we get out here. Um, so how did the podcast come about?
Yeah, so I had, if you go very, very, very far back in the 100 Words podcast feed, you'll notice something called First World Problems, and those are that's basically the kind of the first iteration of what I wanted to do from a podcast perspective. So, like I mentioned, with the inception of Leo Laporte and Mark Maron in my life, and podcasting in general, I just love, like, I completely credit in the same way that you credit Mark for putting you onto the idea of like what a compelling interview can be, and these sort of the chat based show. I was like, okay, music is completely absent from podcasting in general. Like, you have like All Songs Considered. This is, I'm talking like late 2000s, like there was nothing as far as like independent music chatter. And so
Yeah.
I was like, dude, I want something that is like that, but is not just like us talking about like, hey, this tour was announced this week. Cause like, it seems stupid. It just seemed really self-defeating. And so I was like, okay, I want let's have 2 of my friends, and then like maybe a guest can come on, and we can like review some records, like talk about what we've been listening to recently and kind of have a pseudo interview with this person. And so I did that. And then basically I did that for maybe about, I don't know, 20 to 25 episodes or so. And we kind of try to do them once a month. At that time, we had, like no skin in the game whatsoever. And we were just like having fun with the medium. And so as people started to kind of gravitate towards the show and were like, oh, like this was cool. And like, hey, like wow, I can't even believe 200 people downloaded this thing. This is ridiculous. Like, why is anybody listening? This is just me BSing with my friends for an hour and a half. And so as things started to progress and like I was doing all of the editing and, guest booking, and it just became so cumbersome to schedule 4 people, where it was like myself and then my 2 friends who I was doing the show with and then a guest. I was like, this is not sustainable in the long term. But I still love podcasts and I still want to do one. So then I went to my friends and I was like, by that time we hadn't published an episode in like 3 or 4 months. And so I was like, hey guys, would you be bummed if I just like did this on my own? Like I love you. It has nothing to do with you as an individual, but like it was a hard conversation for me to have and I was super nervous about it. But they both were just like, no, it's fine, dude. Totally. Yeah, go for it. Do your thing. And I was like, oh, okay, thanks. I guess that's what good friends are for.
Yeah.
But so by that time, then I just focused on the idea of like, okay, it'll be myself, one guest, I'll basically be the Mark Maron of independent music, as it were. Not limit myself to one genre of music or one person in a band, like, because I know my friend Shane Told does a podcast that is very similar to mine called Lead Singer Syndrome, and he only has lead singers on. And so, but I not only did I not want that sort of singular focus, but I wanted the ability to be able to pull in, frankly, some of my favorite conversations I've ever had are with people who I like to call secret punks. So
yeah,
I Roman Mars from 99% Invisible and Radiotopia, I've been obsessed with his show for a long time. And I had watched him do a couple of speaking engagements where he spoke about like Misfits, Black Flag, just like, some little breadcrumbs of like, okay, I think this dude knows what's up with punk. And so I approached him, just emailed him coldly. I don't know him at all. I was like, hey, like, would you be interested in talking about music for about an hour? And he was like, oh, I would love to, because most people obviously talk to him about either architecture or 99% Invisible, the podcast,
Yeah.
And so he was so excited to do it. And then like, a couple minutes into it, I realized his knowledge goes super deep. And like he has built the whole Radiotopia, public radio thing that he is doing off of the idea of like Discord records. And like in the middle of the conversation, he was just like, you know what? Like, I haven't said this in a long time, but he's like, I'm straight edge. And I was just like, dude, that's great. I'm straight edge too. And like just having like this public radio icon be like, oh yeah, I'm straight edge. I'm just like, come on, that's so cool. So anyways, I just wanted to kind of encapsulate all of these, the ability for me to have these conversations with a bunch of different people, as long as they've been, to tie back to our original point and discussion point of being in, small sweaty rooms together. It's like that experience is so valuable, and being able to show that connective tissue to be like, hey, this person has built the sort of business principles and life principles that they exist in now, all because they decided to, buy a record at 14 years old that, changed their life forever. And like having the space to have those conversations is, why I obviously still do the podcast, and essentially why I started to do it in the first place. But I just didn't know exactly how I was going to arrive to that, besides just pulling in my friends and pulling all the people that I had experience within independent music, and just being like, let's have some real conversations. And frankly, it was very selfish of me, just because I wanted to be able to get to know some of these people better, because even though I've known some people for 10, 15 years, to have these like intimate hour-long conversations where there's no there was no quote unquote purpose per se, but then if I'm able to, disguise it under the idea of a podcast, it was like, oh yeah, well, like, it's a promotional look, so of course I'll do that. And it's like, oh yeah, I can get to know Ray a little bit better, and vice versa. And so you combine all that, and then that's essentially why I still care so much about it.
Yeah, I agree completely. That's why I love doing my show, because so often I don't think you have this kind of conversation anymore, really, in 2019. And I've had so many conversations with people that I've known for years, but I don't really know. And then I've gotten to get to know them better. And I feel like that's, again, I agree with you. I'm doing it for me, and then also being able to share it, and then also hear other people hear it and enjoy it. It makes me feel a little less alone in the world, which I really dig. And you're actually going to be my 100th episode, Ray.
Yeah, dude, I love that. I love that those those random earmarkers that you have where it's just like, oh yeah, 100 feels good, or like, yeah, how about the 200th episode or whatever. So yeah, well, I feel privileged and honored. So thank you.
Absolutely, man, and thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it, Ray.
No, it's my pleasure. I mean, you have two white dudes talking on a podcast. Like, isn't that what the whole podcasting medium is all about?
I think that's how it started. I think that's going to start. That's starting to change soon, which I think is good. But I'll never not be excited to talk music with people that also like music. So.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm with you, and I feel I feel lucky to be invited on your thing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray. And if Taken plays New York, I'll make sure to make it out so I can see you.
We are trying to come in. We play a show this weekend, and I finally get all the band members in the room together. So we're trying to plan out our November, because we got an offer to play in Brooklyn, and so now I'm just trying to figure out the timing of it all. But by the end of the year, I might be able to cash you in on that.
Awesome, sounds good. Thank you so much for talking to me, Ray.
No problem, dude. Keep me posted.
I most certainly will. You have a good one.
All right, bye, Will.
Bye. Okay, folks, for the 100th time I'm saying this, that is our show for this week. Thank you guys so much for continuing to support me and to support the podcast. I appreciate you being here. And if you guys want to support me on Patreon, it's patreon.com/awesomedisaster. And you can support 100 Words or Less on Patreon as well. And thank you to Ray for your time and hospitality. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and for your candor. So thank you guys again for listening. I've been Will Carey. I'm on Twitter @ComicWillCarey, and you can follow the podcast on Twitter as well @AwesomeDPod. I plan to continue to do this show for as long as I enjoy it, and this is one of my favorite things that I do. So I will continue to do this, and I hope that you guys continue to listen. Thank you again for being here, and I will see you folks next week between Awesome and Disaster. Take care, everybody.